The sun burned high above Dry Creek, pressing its heat upon the land until even the air seemed to waver. Jonah McCrae rode through the glare, his hat pulled low, his horse's hooves striking the cracked trail in slow, patient rhythm. The desert was a colorless sea, nothing but dust, sage, and bones bleached white by years without mercy. He had been in the saddle since dawn, riding 40 miles from his ranch for nothing more than barley feed. Drought had bitten deep that year, turning every mouthful for his horses into a choice between hope and hunger. Dry Creek rose from the horizon like a ghost of a town, its buildings leaning beneath the sun, paint peeled to gray, signs half hanging by rusted chains. Jonah guided his horse down the main street. A few men lounged outside the saloon, too weary to drink, too proud to leave. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and sour whiskey, an old perfume of despair. He stopped before Rourke's general store, tied his horse to a splintered post, and patted its hot neck. "Won't be long, boy," he said. Inside, the light dimmed to amber gloom. Shelves sagged under bolts of cloth, jars of beans, and dull-labeled tins. Abel Rourke stood behind the counter, chest puffed as he recounted some story to two ranchers. "I told her last week, no more credit," Rourke declared, slapping the counter for emphasis. "A woman's got to learn to manage better. That Ada Whitlow's been trouble since the day she set foot in this town." The ranchers chuckled. "Trouble before her husband died, worse after," one muttered. Jonah ignored the talk and set his coins on the counter. 3 sacks of barley. "Jonah McCrae." Rourke grinned, switching to the smile of a merchant smelling profit. "Haven't seen you in town for months." $12. Jonah paid, but before Rourke could count the bills, the bell over the door rang. Conversation froze. A woman stepped in. She couldn't have been more than 25, though hardship had etched fine lines around her eyes. Her dark hair was tied back in a simple knot. Her dress was clean but mended many times. She carried herself straight, chin high, as though daring the room to remind her she was poor. "Mr. Rourke," she said softly, "I need flour, salt, and a tin of lard." "Cash up front," Rourke replied, his voice flat as iron. Ada Whitlow opened a small purse and placed a few coins on the counter. Jonah saw at once it wasn't enough. Rourke counted the money slowly, enjoying the shame in every clink. "This'll cover half the flour," he said. "No salt, no lard." "Then half the flour," Ada answered, her voice steady though her hands trembled. Tom Garrett smirked from the back. "Maybe you ought to find another way to pay, widow. Folks say a woman alone can get creative." Ada turned, eyes flashing like struck flint. "I earn what I need honest, Mr. Garrett, which is more than some can say." Another man muttered, "Honest women don't poison their husbands." The words dropped like a stone into silence. Three days passed before Jonah admitted what his heart already knew. He hadn't finished his business in Dry Creek. The barley sat untouched in his barn, while his thoughts kept circling back to the widow and her quiet defiance. By the third morning, he saddled his horse again, a small sack of seed corn tied behind the saddle. He told himself it was waste seed, past its prime, but worth something to someone who still believed in growing things. The road south shimmered in the noonday light. The sky was an empty sheet of brass, the world a furnace of red dust. When the Whitlow place finally appeared, it looked smaller than he remembered. The roof sagged, the porch bowed, the fence slumped like an old man's shoulders. Weeds had swallowed what used to be a garden. A little girl stood in the yard, barefoot in the dirt. She couldn't have been more than 6, her mother's dark hair falling into solemn eyes. She watched him approach without fear or curiosity, just the quiet weariness of a child who had already learned too much about struggle. Jonah touched his hat to her. Before he could speak, the front door opened. Ada Whitlow stood in the threshold with a kitchen knife in her hand. Her face was pale and drawn, but her stance was steady. A woman who had fought too many small wars and didn't plan to lose another. When she recognized him, the knife wavered slightly, then lowered, though her grip stayed firm. "Mr. McCrae," she said. "Jonah," he corrected gently. "Brought some seed. Thought it might help." Her eyes narrowed. "Thought maybe the poor widow could use charity. Thought maybe someone trying to keep a garden alive in a drought could use a few kernels sitting useless in my barn." They faced each other across the tired yard until, at last, Ada exhaled and stepped aside. "I suppose you'd better come in." Inside was bare but clean, 3 mismatched chairs, a wood stove, shelves half empty except for the goods he'd helped her buy. Poverty yet preserved with dignity. "Sarah," Ada called, and the little girl slipped inside, clutching her mother's skirt. "Would you like some water, Mr. McCrae?" Ada asked, her voice careful, as if offering it cost something precious. "I'm fine," Jonah said. "Just thought I'd drop off seed and share a few tricks about planting it right." Suspicion still lingered in her gaze, but finally she nodded. "Show me then." They spent the afternoon in the yard, kneeling in the dry earth. Jonah showed her how to plant deep, how to pack the soil to trap what little moisture might come, how to water only at dawn and dusk. Sarah followed silently, holding kernels in her apron, her small shadow flickering beside them in the heat. As the sun dipped, Ada's hands shook from exhaustion. Jonah noticed the hollows in her arms, the faint tremor of hunger she never mentioned. He wiped the sweat from his brow. "That's enough for today," he said. "Seeds need time to settle." Ada sat back on her heels, staring at the furrows. That night, the sky split open. Thunder rolled across the desert like cannon fire, shaking the windows of Jonah McCrae's ranch. He turned in bed, sleepless, staring into the dark. Every flash of lightning carved the outline of his room, then left him blind again. He tried to think of his horses, his fences, the rain he'd prayed for, but each crash of thunder dragged his thoughts back to the widow and her child in that collapsing house. Were they dry? Were they safe? He told himself it wasn't his concern. But when the wind howled through the rafters and rain began to hammer the roof, he gave up pretending. Jonah was already in the saddle when the storm reached its height. The trail to the Whitlow place had turned to mud, the rain blinding, but he pushed on, leaning low in the saddle as lightning ripped the sky open again and again. The horse stumbled, righted itself, pressed forward. Every flash revealed the lonely silhouette of the Whitlow house ahead, half swallowed by shadow and rain. He heard the child crying before he reached the porch. Inside, the roof was failing. Water poured through cracked shingles, turning the floor to mud. Ada was trying to catch the leaks with buckets, soaked through, hair plastered to her face. "Get out!" Jonah shouted over the roar. "To the barn!" She spun toward him, eyes wide, relief flashing for a heartbeat before she masked it again. "The roof's going. I can't stop it." "Grab what you need," he ordered. "We move now." Ada snatched a small sack of clothes and dry food, while Jonah lifted Sarah into his arms. The child clung to him, crying against his shoulder. They stumbled through the storm, the world a blur of water and wind. Behind them, the sound of collapsing wood cracked like a gunshot. The barn loomed out of the darkness, its doors half torn from the hinges, but it still stood. Jonah forced them open, guided horse and child inside, then shoved the doors shut against the wind. The air inside smelled of hay and damp earth, but it was shelter. He moved quickly, stacking bales of hay to block the worst of the drafts. From a rusted bucket he built a small fire, feeding it bits of dry wood until it glowed faintly. Ada crouched near it, wrapping Sarah in a blanket. Her hands shook as she tried to warm the child. "You'll freeze," she said when Jonah pulled off his coat and draped it around them both. "I'll manage," he replied. "That child won't." They sat close, the storm raging outside like a living beast. Rain drummed on the roof in furious rhythm. The little fire flickered across their faces, painting them in orange light. Sarah's crying slowed to hiccups, then silence. Exhaustion overtook her, head against her mother's chest. Ada's eyes glistened in the glow. "It's gone, isn't it?" she whispered. "The house. Half the roof's down," Jonah admitted. "But the walls are still standing. It can be rebuilt." "With what?" she said bitterly. "I spent my last coin on flour. There's nothing left." "Joe." Dawn broke pale and quiet after the storm. The desert glistened in a way Jonah McCrae had almost forgotten, puddles shimmering like glass, the air clean and sharp with the smell of wet dust. The Whitlow house stood half-ruined, its roof torn open, its walls bent and weary. Yet amid the wreckage, smoke rose faintly from the barn chimney. They were alive. Jonah walked the yard, boots sinking in the mud, studying the damage. When he returned, Ada was awake, Sarah still asleep in the hollow of her arms. Her eyes were rimmed red from exhaustion, but her chin remained high. "You've done enough," she said quietly. "Go home before this ruins you." Jonah shook his head. "I'll be back tomorrow with lumber and tools. We'll start fresh." "Mr. McCrae." "Jonah," he corrected. "And I don't walk away from folks I've chosen to stand with." The next morning, true to his word, Jonah returned with a wagon load of boards, nails, and a handful of stubborn hope. The sun had returned, hard and hot again, but they worked through it. Together they tore down what couldn't be saved, pulling splintered planks until the frame stood bare against the light. Ada worked beside him, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, her movements firm and deliberate. Her hands blistered, but she never paused. Sarah fetched water, carried nails, proud of every small task. By evening, a new skeleton of beams reached upward, glowing gold beneath the setting sun. They sat on the porch steps that night, weary but alive. Jonah chewed on a strip of jerky, while Ada leaned against the railing, her face streaked with sweat and dust. Sarah fell asleep between them, her head resting on her mother's knee. "Roof will go up tomorrow," Jonah said softly. Ada nodded. "You shouldn't be here this much. People talk. People always talk," he said. "Doesn't mean they're right." She gave a faint smile at that, quick, almost invisible, but Jonah caught it. It felt like the first honest smile he'd seen in months. By the third day, the frame was strong enough to cast its own shadow. The rhythm of hammer and saw carried through the air, a heartbeat of rebuilding. Yet that heartbeat drew others. One afternoon, 3 riders appeared at the gate, Sheriff Watson, Tom Garrett, and Pike Stevens. They dismounted slowly, eyes sharp, faces dark with judgment. "McCrae," the sheriff called. "Folks are talking. A single man spending his days at a widow's place. It don't look proper." Jonah set down his hammer. "Seems to me fixing a roof is proper work." Garrett spat into the dust. "That woman poisoned her husband. Everyone knows it. Ada stepped forward before Jonah could speak. Her dress was patched, her face sunburned, but her stance was proud. Everyone knows lies, Sheriff. And not one of you lifted a hand when this storm left my child sleeping under a leaking roof. Mr. McCrae did. If that shames you, then the shame is yours. The air went still. The men shifted uneasily. Jonah's hand rested near his tool belt, close in. The talk in Dry Creek spread like tumbleweed in wind, quick, mean, impossible to catch. Every man at the saloon had an opinion about Jonah McCrae and the widow up north. Some said he was bewitched, others that guilt had made him soft. By the week's end, the story had curdled into accusation. Jonah didn't hear the worst of it until he rode into town for nails and lantern oil. He'd barely stepped off his horse before Tom Garrett and 4 others blocked his path outside the saloon. Well, if it ain't the Good Samaritan, Garrett sneered. How's the widow's charity work coming? Jonah's jaw tightened. Move aside. Garrett spat near his boot. You think you're some kind of hero? She poisoned her husband, and now she's got you playing farmhand like a fool. Before Jonah could answer, Garrett shoved him hard. The others laughed. Jonah's hat hit the ground, and the laughter died when his fist met Garrett's jaw. The man went down in a cloud of dust. The next swung a bottle. Jonah ducked, countered, and pain exploded across his cheek as another fist landed. He fought back without thinking, years of ranch brawls guiding him more than rage. When the shotgun blast cracked the air, everyone froze. Sheriff Watson stood on the porch, barrel smoking. That's enough. Jonah wiped blood from his mouth, breathing hard. Garrett groaned on the ground. You've chosen your side. Garrett spat. This won't end well. Jonah said nothing. He saddled up and rode straight for the Whitlow place, his ribs aching with every step of the horse. When he reached the house, Ada was on the porch, hammering boards into place. She turned, gasped at the sight of his bruised face, and dropped the hammer. Dear God! What happened? Town happened, Jonah said quietly. Inside, Ada cleaned the cut on his cheek. Her hands trembled, but her touch was careful. You're paying for standing with us, she whispered. I told you, he said, steady despite the pain. This is my fight now. She looked up sharply. Why? Why risk everything? He held her gaze. Because I won't stand by while you and Sarah are left alone. Because when I look at you, I see more than trouble. For a moment she said nothing, just stared at him, her eyes wide and shining. Then she turned away, blinking hard. I don't want to hope, Jonah. Hope anyway, he said gently. From that day, he spent more time at the Whitlow Ranch than at his own. He brought food, fixed fences, taught Sarah to ride a pony too small for anything but laughter. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, silence between them turning softer with each sunset. But peace never lasts long in a dry land. One night, Sarah's scream shattered the calm. Jonah burst outside just as rocks smashed through the windows. Figures on horseback whooped from the road, their torches flaring in the dark. Which widow? Someone yelled. Send her back to hell. Jonah grabbed his rifle and fired 2 shots into the air. The riders scattered, their laughter tea. Jonah's ranch sat on higher ground, far enough from town that the noise and gossip couldn't reach. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, fences straight, the barn tight, a windmill creaking softly in the breeze. When Ada and Sarah arrived, they stared in silence at the wide fields and the clean, open sky. For the first time in months, Ada's shoulders eased. This place, she whispered. It feels different. Safer, Jonah said. You'll be all right here. He gave them the small guest room near the kitchen, a patchwork quilt on the bed and a window that caught the dawn. Sarah pressed her hands against the glass, watching the morning light spill across the hills. That first night, she slept without waking in fear. Days passed quietly. Ada tended to the garden, scrubbing the porch, mending clothes. Work steadied her hands. Jonah spent his mornings repairing fences, his afternoons with the horses. Sometimes they shared supper in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. The distance between them began to shrink, not through words, but through small gestures. A meal left waiting, a gate mended before she asked. But Dry Creek's whispers traveled farther than dust. Riders passed on the road, eyes lingering too long. Jonah ignored them, yet the tension sat heavy in his chest. One evening, Ada found him in the barn, brushing down his bay mare. "You shouldn't have brought us here," she said softly. "You'll lose friends. Maybe worse." Jonah looked at her, then back to the horse. "Didn't bring you here for their approval." She wanted to argue, but her voice failed. Instead, she stood beside him, her hand brushing against his sleeve, brief, but enough to make them both still. Later that week, Jonah rode into town for supplies. The streets were quieter than usual, eyes following him from behind half-closed shutters. Abel Rourke stood on his porch, arms folded, his smile thin as wire. "McRae," he said, "still playing the savior? Thought maybe you'd be tired of rescuing liars." Jonah didn't rise to it. He loaded his wagon in silence, but before he left, his eyes caught something on Rourke's counter, an old map of the Dry Creek territory, yellowed and torn. Scrawled in the corner were 3 short lines carved together, a symbol Jonah had seen before. He remembered it from Ada's doorframe, 3 scratches burned into the wood. He thought it was an old mark, maybe a carpenter's sign. Now it felt like something else. That night, under a red sunset, he studied the map again. The mark sat near the old Ridgewell mine, a silver vein abandoned decades earlier after a collapse. The same stream that fed the mine ran downhill toward the Whitlow property. The next morning, Jonah tested a hunch. He filled a tin cup with water from the well behind his barn, cool and clean. Then he rode to the ruins of the Whitlow place. The yard was silent, the garden dry again, the air thick with flies. He lowered a bucket into Ada's old well and pulled it up. The water. Morning came dry and windless, but something in the air felt charged, like the pause before lightning. Jonah McRae sat at his kitchen table, staring at a glass jar filled with cloudy water. The sediment had settled overnight, a thin layer of silver-gray dust at the bottom. Poison born from greed and neglect. When Ada entered, her hair still damp from the basin, she stopped at the sight of it. "That's from my well," she said quietly. Jonah nodded. "Runoff from Ridgewell Mine. The stream runs straight through the old shafts before it feeds your land." "So Samuel," she began, her voice tight. "Didn't die by your hand," Jonah said. "The town killed him with its silence." Ada sat down, her fingers trembling as she reached for the jar but didn't touch it. "They'll never believe it. They don't want to. Then we give them proof." By noon, Jonah had ridden into Dry Creek with the jar tucked in his saddlebag. The saloon porch fell silent when he dismounted. Men who'd laughed at him a week before looked away now. He walked past them, boots ringing sharp on the boards, straight to Sheriff Watson's office. Watson was a thick man with gray whiskers and the slow patience of someone who'd seen too much dust. "McRae," he said, leaning back. "You look like trouble carrying a jar." "Not trouble," Jonah said. "Evidence." He set it down hard enough to make the contents swirl. That's from Ada Whitlow's well. Test it. Taste it, if you've got the guts. The sheriff frowned, sniffed the water, then set it aside. I'm no chemist. Then bring someone who is, Jonah snapped. But look at the mine records. Ridgewell collapsed after the spring floods, right before Samuel Whitlow died. The runoff poisoned his water. Rourke's men were paid to keep quiet. Watson's eyes narrowed. You're accusing half the town. Only the guilty half. There was a long silence. Finally, the sheriff exhaled. All right. Bring me something solid, and I'll act. Until then, watch your back. Jonah left knowing the warning was more than kindness. The same afternoon, he noticed two riders trailing him down the road, faces half hidden under dust scarves. He didn't lead them to the ranch. Instead, he veered into the dry creek bed, waited behind a mesquite thicket, and watched them ride past. Rourke's men. That night, Ada lit a lamp while Jonah unrolled old maps and mining ledgers across the table. Together they traced the creek from the Ridgewell shaft to her property. In the yellow light, their shadows leaned close, voices low. Sarah stirred in the next room, murmuring in her sleep. Mama, she whispered faintly. The bad water's gone now? Ada's voice caught, but she answered softly. Soon, sweetheart. Soon. Outside, coyotes yipped at the edge of the hills. The night felt heavy with something waiting to happen. Just before dawn, the dogs barked. Jonah was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. He stepped outside and smelled it, kerosene. Flames roared up behind the bee. By sunrise, Dry Creek was boiling with rumor. Some said Jonah McCrae was coming for blood. Others said the widow had bewitched the sheriff. But when Jonah and Ada rode into town that morning, they carried no rifles drawn, only a wagon filled with broken boards and a scorched metal plate marked Ridgewell Silver Company. Sheriff Watson met them in the square, flanked by Abel Rourke and a handful of nervous men. The townsfolk gathered around like buzzards waiting for a verdict. Jonah stepped down, dust rising around his boots. You wanted proof, he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. Here it is. He lifted the blackened plank, still smelling faintly of smoke. They burned my barn to hide it. Tin from the Ridgewell mine, same mine that poisoned the creek, same water that killed Samuel Whitlow. Rourke scoffed. You're spouting nonsense, McCrae. You think anyone will take a rancher's word over mine? Watson held up a hand. Quiet, Abel. His eyes moved to Ada. Mrs. Whitlow, you stand by this claim? Ada's hands were steady now. I do. My husband drew water from that well the week the mine flooded. He was dead 2 days later. And every man here who whispered that I killed him knew better. They just didn't want to cross the ones making money. A ripple of shame passed through the crowd. Jonah reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a glass jar, still half filled with cloudy water. Take it to the next town, he said. Let a doctor test it. He'll find arsenic and mercury. Same as in the Ridgewell stream. Watson studied Jonah for a long moment, then nodded. I'll send a rider. Rourke's face turned red. You'll regret this, Sheriff. You'll ruin us all. Maybe, Watson said. But better ruined than rotten. Tension cracked the air. One of Rourke's hired men twitched toward his pistol, but Jonah's Colt was already drawn. Don't, he said softly. The man froze. When it was over, Rourke was taken into custody. The crowd scattered in uneasy silence. Ada stood beside Jonah, trembling not with fear but with release. For the first time in years, Her name had been spoken without contempt. They left town as clouds rolled in from the west, heavy, swollen, almost black. By the time they reached the ridge, thunder was rumbling low across the desert. At the ranch, Sarah came running from the porch, her laughter bright against the wind. "Mama, it's raining!" she cried. The first drops fell fat and cold, speckling the dust. Then the sky broke open. Rain poured down in silver sheets, washing over the scorched ground, the broken boards, the weary souls beneath it. Ada tilted her face up, eyes closed, letting the water run through her hair. Jonah watched her, hat in hand, the storm soaking them both. The smell of wet earth rose around them, clean, alive, forgiving. Sarah danced barefoot in the mud, her laughter carrying through the storm. Ada reached for Jonah's hand. He hesitated only a moment before taking it. "What are we doing, Jonah?"